First off, apologies for the poor lighting. I'll fix that in the next week. We just had some issues. I'll get it sorted. Despite my crappy video quality though, today we're going to be looking at Rampage, the newest film from Brad Peyton, whose last film, San Andreas, I actually quite enjoyed. I don't think that many people did though. And like San Andreas, this one stars Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who has a knack for being a very likeable presence and actually elevating these silly action films to another level, not transcending anything, but just being enjoyable. Naomi Harris stars alongside The Rock as they both try and deal with a situation involving some genetic experiments falling from the sky and getting into the hands and mainly the insides of a few animals across the planet, making them bigger and, more importantly, much more aggressive. One of these animals is George, an albino gorilla that The Rock works with in a sanctuary, and as he gets loose, he gets dragged into this plot, and that's sort of where the film goes from there. So Rampage is actually the latest video game movie, and I wouldn't give that too much credit because it's the type of game, I haven't played it myself, but it's pretty much plotless. It's just a concept, and that concept is carried over to this film, that being big monsters fighting. In the game, you actually play as monsters or people that have turned into monsters, and they're destroying buildings and such, so not quite what's happening here, but it's pretty much irrelevant. It's hard to drum up any real strong feelings for this film, but I suppose I'll give it a go. The world building itself, let's start there, is basically done in 2 sentences at the beginning of the movie, saying, on this day, this thing was created, and on this day, this thing is illegal. And that's world building 101. 2 lines of white text against a black background, that's all I need in films. And from there, you're pretty much thrown into it, and these initial scenes is The Rock going around with a group of people in his sanctuary, and he is his typical self. He's funny. It's very clear from the beginning that this film isn't going to be especially well written, but this initial start to the film kind of sets you up for the film with a light tone and kind of a nice, fun atmosphere. Watching The Rock actually interact with George the gorilla in this early section, the movie is trying to sell that these two are friends, and it does kind of work because these initial scenes are light and there's sort of a heartwarming element to it, and the effects themselves are convincing. They aren't the recent reboot series Planet of the Apes level, but they don't have to be. They're convincing enough. I think the film adequately sets up for a fun blockbuster, a fun popcorn film that was kind of what I was expecting here, a big, dumb popcorn film, and that is what it is, technically on paper. But I can't say I had all that much fun with it once it gets into the actual meat of the film. Suddenly the tone of the film gets a lot more dour, and whilst I enjoyed watching The Rock earlier on interacting with the ape, he's suddenly having to interact with people, and they don't seem to have gotten the message that they're supposed to be having a good time, except for Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who is completely hamming up everything he's doing in a way that I initially wasn't into. He kind of has this cowboy act, and he initially comes across as sort of a villain, but then there turns out to be, in a caricatured way, a little bit more to his character, and I kind of liked how it worked into the whole movie. I think if the whole film felt as light as his character did, he would have worked better, but he does sort of stick out like a sore thumb when attributed to the rest of what's going on. I do think he conflicts with the overall tone of the film, but I think that's a result of Brad Peyton not really realising that the film he's making isn't as fun as he thinks. It's moderately engaging. It's a passive experience. I could sit and watch it, and in fairness to it, I was never actively bored, and it did kind of fly by. It didn't feel like a nearly 2-hour long film, but I was never actively having fun. That's because the writing was bad without being funny, and I also think the decision to actually put some gore in this film, it's not a gore fest, but I think that decision itself also changes the overall tone of or what it feels like the film's going for. So this silly cowboy character doesn't work, and it's all these conflicting elements that I feel like he's trying to have fun, and he wants us to have fun, but I'm not having fun. It's also another film with a villainous corporation in it, which is, a cliche, but fine. The faces of this corporation, Malin Ackerman and Jake Lacey, I hope I said both those names right, they're brother and sister, and they're such cartoon villains again. I don't think they fit. Of course, the concept of Rampage is good for a cartoon movie, but there are so many conflicting elements that these two, especially, I just found really annoying whenever the movie would take us aside to them. I didn't enjoy it. They were quite obnoxious, and they just derailed the film. Thankfully, we didn't hang about them for too long, but I almost feel like we could just cut them out of the film completely. So I think the main issue of the film is this issue with the characters. Even The Rock, who is normally a charismatic presence, eventually isn't, as I've said, when he has to interact with people, but they still try and flesh out his backstory, saying he's been in wars and how he prefers animals to people and why he feels that way, but it's really just sort of touched upon as a sort of a checklist. It's another one of those films where you can feel the checklist being ran through. I'm glad that the film didn't have too much of an emphasis on a romantic element. It's hinted at, but it's not like something that builds up the entire film. They don't flirt the entire thing, so I didn't have to roll my eyes whenever that happened. Of course, at its core, this is an action film, and there is action generously peppered throughout the film. So if you're coming for that, I think it's going to keep you engaged. As I say, I was sort of with it the entire time. Whilst the CGI is convincing, I think it really lacks that meaty weight, that scale, that heft that was so present in Pacific Rim, 2014's Godzilla, and even Kong Skull Island, despite that film's flaws. I think it's more of a Pacific Rim 2 situation where, yes, well done, you have very detailed models of these huge, hefty creatures, but you're not portraying it through the actual movements and the camera angles. But it's serviceable, and it all ends in a big fight, which I think people are mostly here for. This isn't like 2014 Godzilla in that you're constantly kept back from the creatures the whole movie. They're sort of peppered throughout, but the big fight is at the end, and I think it's enjoyable enough. Minimal brain activity, minimal engagement, but minimal engagement, still engagement. I also wish the film was a bit more colourful. It's very grey. You have these huge animals mutating into these bigger and sort of spliced creatures. You have a lot of opportunity there for colour, just to make things a little bit more interesting. But there isn't any, and that kind of sucks. Rampage is a deeply flawed film, and I don't think that's really going to surprise anyone, but I do think the big issue is that it could have superseded these flaws by making the film that I think Brad Payton thinks he's made. That being the really light and tone film, the one with all the jokes and the one with all the characters he's put in there to keep this going. But by making it so grey and just not especially funny, he's not quite nailing that. And I do think that really damages the product in the end. But again, I don't really have strong feelings about it. It didn't feel as long as it was. So I was somewhat there the entire time. I wasn't explicitly bored. But I'm just not going to remember it. It's just something that happened today, and I'm already starting to sort of forget it. So with all that said, I'm going to have to give Rampage a 5 out of 10. I don't think it's going to blow anyone's mind, but I don't think it really has to. I think some people are going to enjoy it a little bit more than I did. I really wanted to enjoy it just on even just a base level. And there were some elements, but in the end, somewhat meh. If you're going to see Rampage, I reckon there is a chance that you're actually going to quite enjoy this film. But personally, I still think everyone should be going to see Ready Player One. But that's just me. Thank you very much, guys. I should be back tomorrow with a review of Truth or Dare. We'll see how that goes. But until then, see ya.